All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever it is that you're dialing in from today. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us here today. I am Lacey Coling. I am a member of the board for the Pheo Alliance. I'm also a patient with metastatic paraganglioma, and I'm currently enrolled in a clinical trial with lanreotide at the National Institutes of Health. I'm here today with Dr. Camilo Jimenez to bring you this webinar on belfutazane for advanced pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. I will introduce Dr. Jimenez in more depth in a few moments. This program is brought to you by the Pheo Alliance, whose mission is to empower patients with pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma, their families, and medical professionals through advocacy, education, and a global community of support while helping to advance research that accelerates treatments and cures. Some upcoming events that we have are our peer support meetings. Our next one is on Tuesday, November 4th at 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern. We also have World Net Cancer Day is on November 10th. I will be at the NIH. If anybody is around, I'd love to see you and give you a zebra ribbon. We also have our annual fireside chat with Dr. Karel Potzik, which will happen on Wednesday, December 3rd at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time or 12 p.m. Eastern. You can find out about all of these events and more information at thepheopara.org. A couple other resources to highlight. We have posted a statement on our website about belzutifan, and we'll post that link in the chat as well so that you're able to get to it. For today's agenda, first we're going to have Dr. Jimenez presenting information on the belzutifan trial for advanced pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma, and then we'll hold our Q&A session. You can type your questions in the chat section at any time, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as time allows. I also have all of the questions that everyone submitted, and we'll group those together and ask those questions as well if they're not answered during the presentation. One disclaimer is that this information presented on this webinar is for educational purposes only and should not substitute for the advice of any of your doctors or medical team because they have in-depth knowledge of your medical history and current situation. Now, it is my honor to introduce our expert presenter, Dr. Camilo Jimenez. We have shortened his bio considerably, but his experience is extensive. Most importantly, related to this session, Dr. Jimenez is the leading worldwide principal investigator of the phase 2 clinical trial with belzutifan for patients with metastatic Pheo and para. He recently presented at the 2025 European Society for Medical Oncology ESMO Annual Congress Conference on October 18th and will simultaneously publish in the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Jimenez is a tenured professor at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center and an expert in endocrine cancers, particularly metastatic Pheos and paras. He has led groundbreaking research on high specific activity MIBG as an effective medication for metastatic Pheo and paras, resulting in this medication as the first FDA approved medication in the United States. We are so honored and grateful to have him as part of our medical advisory board as well. I will hand the program over to you now, Dr. Jimenez, to present at this time. Thank you.
And really, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you everybody for the interest that you have on this particular topic. And I think it's time for me to share the slides, right? So I'm going to
All right.
hold the slides, and sorry that it's taking a while. I think I have to minimize this, and I have to make this bigger. And for some reason, here it is. Okay. To put this here, and please let me know if you see the slides.
We can see it.
Okay, very good. And really, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak, and thank you for the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about the history of belzutifan, a hypoxia-inducible factor 2 alpha inhibitor. Just to let you know, this is a webinar that is focused on patients, on families, caregivers, I know that there are several providers attending the seminar, but for your reference, the way I'm going to speak is just with that particular interest. In other words, whenever I describe graphics, I will try to be as explicit, as clear, as concise, as easy as possible, because I think it's important for you to understand how the history of this medication has been developed over time. And just to let you know, this is just the beginning of this history. There will be more coming on much later, and you will see that information as the time goes by. But for now, let's start talking about belzutifan, as I said, a hypoxia-inducible factor 2 alpha inhibitor. Now, I have some disclosures, and they are presented in this slide. And let's go to the outline to this presentation. The outline of this presentation will start with an introduction, where we are going to review the definitions of pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma, and then we'll focus our lecture on metastasis. We'll discuss the frequency of metastasis in people with these tumors. We'll review the clinical features of metastatic disease. We'll review the impact on the overall survival and how the tumors behave over time, making clear that they are quite heterogeneous. We are going to discuss the clusters or families of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, and then we'll focus on the main part of this presentation, which is belzutifan. We are going to define belzutifan, and I'm going to present to all of you the results of the LIFESPARK 15 clinical trial, which is the phase 2 clinical trial of belzutifan for patients with advanced pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. So let's start with some definitions. As you know, pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas are rare tumors in clinical practice. When you look at the incidence of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas in the United States, we believe that maybe 1,000 to 2,000 new cases are discovered every year. When you look at that number, although the number sounds big, in reality it is not that much, keeping in mind that the number of American inhabitants is 330 to 340 million people. So by definition, this is considered an orphan disease. And the problem with orphan diseases is that the development of science, the progress made on it, especially in whatever has to do with treatments, is usually very slow. Saying that, I would say that over the last 25 years, we have made extensive progress, and over the last 8 years, we have seen the appearance of different medications that could be active or effective for the treatment of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas. So let's talk about pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, and let's discuss the origin of these tumors. What are these tumors? These are tumors that are coming from the paraganglia. And by definition, the paraganglia is a group of neuroendocrine cells that will migrate during the embryonic life and will give origin to the different components of the parasympathetic and sympathetic autonomic nervous system ganglia. Of course, this is a definition that to most of you will sound quite complicated, so I'm going to make it easier to understand. So what is the meaning of a neuroendocrine cell? It's a cell that has some features that remind us the neurons, which are part of the brain or of the neurological system, and some features that remind us glands. That's the reason why we call them endocrine. So that's the characteristic that we have in many of them. And they are part of what we call the autonomic nervous system. What is that? The autonomic nervous system is a very important structure that almost every animal, every species of animal will have. And it is important because it's going to help us to survive, to be alive, to be in contact with the environment, connect with the environment, to adjust, and to protect ourselves. It's responsible for many of the mechanisms that keep our bodies, our lives to continue. So to give you an idea, the autonomic nervous system is a collection of electrical connections, nerves that are coming from the brain and the spinal cord, as you see in the graphic located in the right side, and that connect the brain and the spinal cord with the visceral organs. The visceral organs are organs such as the heart, such as the lungs, such as the stomach, the kidneys, the liver, the gastrointestinal tract, the genitourinary tract, and many others. Organs that are responsible for all the vital functions that govern our bodies. And it's considered autonomic because we cannot control it with our consciousness. It has to be independent from our consciousness. We cannot tell the heart, you have to, you have to work, you have to beat. You cannot tell the heart, you have to stop. You cannot tell the lungs, don't breathe. You cannot tell the lungs, breathe faster. You cannot tell the kidneys, clean in this way or don't clean right now. No, they have to do it independently from whatever we think is important, because in that way we are able to protect our lives and we are able to relate to the environment in which we live. So that's the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is pretty much the paraganglia. Now, the paraganglia has stations that we call electrical stations or autonomic nervous system ganglia, and it is in those structures that are located midway in between the brain and the spinal cord and the visceral organs, where occasionally we see the development of paragangliomas and pheochromocytomas. By definition, the pheochromocytomas are tumors that are coming from the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are located on top of the kidneys, and examples of pheochromocytomas is what you see in the left side of this slide. In this slide, and I'm not sure if you see my arrow here or not, could you please tell me if you see it moving around?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. So this is an angiogram with tomographic reconstruction. It's a very sophisticated test. It's quite colorful. And just to give you an idea, what we have here is the abdominal cavity, and here we have the kidneys. This is the right kidney, this is the left kidney, and what we have here is the spleen. And in green, we have two different tumors on top of the kidneys, and they are comparable with pheochromocytomas. They are coming from the adrenal medulla, which is the central part of the adrenal glands. So the name pheochromocytoma is given exclusively to those tumors that are coming from the adrenal medulla. Now, in the right side, you will see paraganglioma. A paraganglioma is a tumor that is coming from outside the adrenal medulla. It's coming from those autonomic nervous system ganglia that could be located at any site in between the skull base and the pelvic area. The one you see located in the right side here in green is a tumor that is coming from what we call the soccer candle organ. This is a structure that, as you can see here, is located in between big vessels. We are talking about the iliac arteries and the iliac veins. It is in front of the spine, it's in between the abdomen and in between the pelvis, and it's in a location that is posterior in between the abdominal and pelvic cavity. So this is an example of a paraganglioma. Now, majority of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, fortunately, are not metastatic. However, up to 25% of pheochromocytomas or paragangliomas may develop metastasis. Metastasis means that the tumor spreads into other organs, and that's why we call them metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas. Currently, there is no histological, there is no molecular, there is no biochemical, there is no genetic marker that we can use to differentiate in between tumors regarding the potential of metastasis. In the past, and you may still see that in scientific literature and in information that you will see online, we still talk about benign or malignant tumors. But no, those are definitions that are not correct. In reality, all pheochromocytomas, all paragangliomas have the potential to spread. The good thing is that majority of them don't do it. Nevertheless, the number that spreads is significant. We are talking about 25% of tumors. Now, when you look at metastatic pheochromocytomas and metastatic paragangliomas, these are tumors that are quite heterogeneous in their clinical behavior. As you know, many of the pheochromocytomas, many of the paragangliomas, just based on origin, are able to produce hormones that we call catecholamines, and they include adrenaline and noradrenaline. And those names always remind us stress. Yes, they are the hormones of stress. They are hormones that are important for all of us to fight when we are in a dangerous situation and to escape, or to have both of them, to fight and escape at the same time. So that's really why these hormones are very important. They are there to protect us. They are there to help us to survive. And they are produced sometimes by pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas that are not under any type of regulation. And because of that, those hormones make symptoms such as palpitations, headaches, sweats, panic attacks, tremors, and many others. The important part here is that many pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas produce these hormones, and because of that excessive production, they may lead to cardiovascular disease, gastrointestinal problems, and some psychological issues. In the case of the cardiovascular disease, people may develop hypertension. And because of the hypertension, or sometimes just because of the direct toxicity related to the catecholamines, people are at risk for heart attacks, strokes, arrhythmias, congestive heart failure, and many other problems. In the case of the gastrointestinal tract, these hormones are going to slow down the gastrointestinal tract, they decrease the motility, and they may predispose to constipation. And constipation is a symptom that is frequently overlooked, but believe me, we have to be careful because it can worsen over time, and in some people could be quite dangerous, up to the point that some patients with pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma have died because of constipation in the past. And finally, we may see some mental issues, anxiety, stress without any cause, and the presence of panic attack as possible complications related to the hormonal excess. Now, when you look at the first statement, it says that tumors may or may not be hormonally active, and that's true. I would say that maybe 75 to 80% of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas that are metastatic will have an increased production of hormones, but there is a substantial number of patients who may not. And that's good, because at least those patients may be at a lower risk for having hormonal complications. Another interesting aspect is the one that you are going to see in the second statement. Up to 50% of metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas are associated with SDHB mutations. Now, I'm going to use the word mutation. In science, in reality, they should be called germline pathogenic variants. But for the purpose of this lecture, we are going to use the word mutation. So yes, as many of you know, there are people who have pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas who carry a mutation in the SDHB gene. And yes, many of those carriers, whenever they develop the pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, present with metastasis. In other words, it's a type of mutation that, for reasons that are not clear to us, is frequently associated with a more aggressive clinical presentation. What is interesting about this type of mutation is that it is telling us what is going on somewhat from a molecular perspective inside the tumor. These are tumors characterized by pseudohypoxia. What is the meaning of pseudohypoxia? It means that you have oxygen, but you are not able to use it. And if you are not able to use it, you activate several genes that are going to be disorganized, and they lead to the abnormal proliferation of some cells, the development of metastases, the formation of abnormal vessels, which is what we call angiogenesis, and an increased survival of those abnormal cells, which together determine the presence and the development of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas. Another interesting aspect of metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas is that about 60 to 70% of them express what we call the noradrenaline transporter in the cell membranes. The noradrenaline transporter is just a protein that they use to reuptake, to take the hormones that they are releasing into the blood back into the cell. And because of that, you will see that some of these tumors are MIBG avid. That's the reason why sometimes we do MIBG scans, and they were especially important whenever we were looking for patients who could be treated with the first FDA-approved medication in clinical practice, which was high specific activity MIBG. The commercial name is Acedra. That medication is not available any longer. It was discontinued from clinical practice last year. The reasons were not related to toxicity. It was because the production of the medication was expensive. Most centers were not familiar with its use, and the use of it was limited. In addition, there was substantial scientific misleading information that prevented sometimes the use of this medication in clinical practice. But that's another story. But I just want you to have the historical context here. When you look at metastasis, the metastases mainly happen in four different organs. They can happen in many different organs, in many different tissues, but the most commonly ones affected by pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas are the lymph nodes. They are affected in about 80% of cases. The skeletal tissue is affected in 72 to 75% of individuals, the liver and the lungs, and they are affected in about 50% of patients. And when you look at the pattern of metastasis, the way they behave over time, in 50% of patients, they are synchronic. And the meaning of synchronic is that when you discover the primary tumor, the tumor that is responsible for the metastases are present at the same time. In other words, you see someone who has a pheochromocytoma in the adrenal gland and at the same time has lesions located in the skeleton, in the lungs, and in the liver. That's what we call synchronic. There are others that we call metachronic. They are about 50% of cases. They are not present at the time of discovery of the primary tumor. In other words, the primary tumor looks isolated, but they may appear, they may develop some months, years, or even decades later in the context of pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma disease. And where am I going with this? I'm going with this to the next graphic because it's telling us more about how heterogeneous the tumors may be. In this graphic, we are going to discuss the overall survival of metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas. And when we discuss overall survival, we always have to compare with people who do not have metastasis. So in the graphic, you are going to see individuals who do not have metastasis in the yellow color and individuals who have metastasis in the white color. And what you see is the survival rate located in the vertical part, which is what we call the y-axis, and in the x-axis, which is the horizontal, you will see the time of survivorship in years. Now, the graphics are clear. People who have metastatic disease live shorter when compared with people who do not have metastatic disease. The survival rates are approximately 60% at 5 years. In other words, after 5 years of initial diagnosis, 60% of patients are alive, 40% of patients may not be alive. And what is important of this graphic is that it is telling us again that they are quite heterogeneous in clinical presentation. For instance, when you look at the upper part of the Y graphic, you will see people who live very shortly. These are people who, fortunately, are not many, but they exist. These are individuals who, unfortunately, have presented with tumors that grow very fast, tumors that kill the individual in a matter of weeks or months, no longer than 1 or 2 years. They are aggressive, but they are not the most common ones. Conversely, you may go into the lower part of this graphic and you will see some people who have metastatic disease in whom the tumors behave very well for reasons that are not clear to us. The tumors spread into organs such as the liver, such as the lungs, such as the skeletal tissue, and they simply are happy there. They stop growing, they don't bother any longer, they are asymptomatic, and many of these patients are able to achieve a normal lifespan. And for these patients, as we currently don't have any curative therapies, we may not even need to provide any type of systemic therapy. They are not the most common ones. Fortunately, they exist, and hopefully, many of the patients who develop pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas with metastasis would behave like this. Now, majority of patients are really in between these two edges. Patients who exhibit some disease progression over time, people who are going to need some type of systemic therapy at some point in their lives just to prevent complications and to improve their survivorship. Now, another important aspect is what you see in the right side of the slide. The morbidity and the survivorship of patients with pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma is determined mainly by three different factors. Now, for clarification, what is morbidity? Morbidity is the problems, the complications. So we were talking about high blood pressure, we talk about constipation, and yes, the tumor burden and the location of the disease may lead to problems. So for instance, if you have bone metastases, those bone metastases may predispose to fractures, bone pain, and other complications. So it's something that we have to keep in mind. And in that order of ideas, we have to remember that the tumor burden, the size of the disease, the speed of progression, and the hormonal activity are perhaps together the three most important factors that determine the survival and the quality of life that many patients with pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma that are metastatic may have. Now, this is a complicated slide, and I don't pretend you to understand the molecular aspects here. What I want you to know is that when we look about, or when we talk about pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, from a molecular perspective, they belong to three different families. And in science, we call those families clusters. One of them is cluster number one, another one, cluster two, and the third one is cluster number three, and they are in this graphic from the left to the right. Cluster number one is the one that I mentioned to you before, associated with SDHP mutations in many patients, is the cluster of pseudohypoxia. But we may see this cluster associated with other mutations, such as, for instance, the ones that predispose to other paraganglioma syndromes, such as the paraganglioma syndrome type 1, which is associated with the SDHD mutation, the paraganglioma syndrome type 3, associated with the SDHC mutation, and the paraganglioma syndrome type 2, which is associated with the SDHIF2 mutations. We may see here also patients who carry mutations in malase and fumarase, and people who have, for instance, the von Hippel-Lindau disease. They belong to the family number one or the cluster number one. Family number two or cluster number two is associated with kinase signaling abnormalities. To give you an idea, these are individuals who have multiple endocrine neoplasia type 2, people with neurofibromatosis type 1, or the rare individuals who have mutations in the TMEN127. And cluster number three is the smallest family, is the one that has not been very well defined, clinically speaking, is associated with Wen signaling abnormalities. Now, when you look at the aggressiveness of the different families, most cases that are aggressive in clinical practice belong to family number one. And when you look at the rate of metastasis in those patients, yes, or not at the rate of metastasis, when you look at the people who have metastatic disease, about 80 to 85% of those individuals belong to this particular family, the family of pseudohypoxia. What is important to keep in mind is that it's in that family where we have a stabilization of a factor that we call the hypoxia-inducible factor 2 alpha that becomes somewhat crazy and induces the development of tumors, and that's the reason why a medication like Belzutifan has been developed. Now, cluster number two, about 5 to 10% of cases that are metastatic belong to this cluster, and in the case of cluster number three, about 5 to 7% of cases with metastasis belong to that particular family. So this is just to give you a little bit of the background that indicates or that led to the evaluation of Belzutifan as a potential treatment for people with pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. So what is Belzutifan? Belzutifan is a very small molecule, it's a very small drug that is going inside the nuclei of the cell, which is this very round structure in brown color, and it's going to look for this molecule that we call the hypoxia-inducible factor 2 alpha, and it's going to prevent the actions of this molecule inside in the nuclei in the genes that are responsible for the regulation of cell proliferation, survival, metastasis, and angiogenesis. That's the reason why this medication moved into what is the LISPARK 015 clinical trial of Belzutifan in patients with advanced pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. So I'm going to tell you about the clinical trial, and again, this is a lecture that is mainly focused on patients, family, and caregivers. So the language that I'm going to use is going to be just for that. And please tell me if things are not clear. Raise your hands, or put questions in the chat if things need to be explained further. As we have discussed, the hypoxia-inducible factor 2 alpha dysregulation is a key factor for the development of many metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas. And we can say that again because of the frequency. As I mentioned to all of you before, about 80 to 85% of metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas belong to the family number 1, the cluster number 1. And in that order of ideas, as we previously discussed, germline pathogenic variants or mutations in those different components of the Krebs cycle, which are the succinate dehydrogenase and the subunits, again, the A, B, C, and B, responsible for the paraganglioma syndromes, as well as enzymes such as fumarase and malase, may lead to the development of pseudohypoxia, that condition in which there is oxygen, but the cell is not able to use it, and because of that, you stabilize the hypoxia-inducible factor, leading to the development of tumor cells. That is also connected with the von Hippel-Lindau disease in regards to the oxygen signaling pathway. In addition, we have to remember that many patients who have apparently who have metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas who do not have gene mutations exhibit the same molecular features of those that we have in cluster number 1 or in family number 1. In other words, we may see several individuals without mutations in whom the tumors behave like those. And keeping in mind that there is a high unmet medical need for patients with advanced pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma, especially knowing that ACEDRA or high specific activity MIBG was discontinued and it only worked for some people, yes, of course, a phase 2 clinical trial with Belzutifan has been developed. And this is the start. I'm going to use some technical words here, but I'm going to clarify everything as we discuss. So this is an international multi-center clinical trial. Is that important? The answer is yes. It's a clinical trial that included 31 centers around the world, and it's multiple centers. Is it important? Yes. We need to have a diverse population. We need to have different types of observations, and that is going to help us to get better information on how the medication is working in the context of pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. And as all clinical trials, we always need to have a main goal that we have to test. That's what we call the primary endpoint. The primary endpoint for the phase 2 clinical trial of Belzutifan is what we describe as objective response rate, or ORR. The objective response rate has to do with the reduction in the size of the tumor. And to make things relatively simple, it is a combination or the addition of two numbers. One number is the number of people who have complete responses. What is a complete response? When you have a tumor and the tumor disappears, that is a complete response. And the number of people who have a partial response. By definition, a partial response is whenever you see a tumor that decreases in size by at least 30% when compared with the baseline features, where the baseline characteristics of the tumor. And yes, this aspect was evaluated by radiologists, and the radiologists who evaluated this were blinded, and the principal investigators didn't know who those radiologists were in order to preserve the quality of the study. Secondary endpoints are the ones that you see in the second line, and they include what you see there, DCR. That's what we call the disease control rate or clinical benefit rate. That's a number that is a little bit different from the previous one. In the DCR, you will have those individuals who have complete responses, again, individuals in whom the tumors disappeared, patients in whom there were partial responses, tumors in whom the disease decreased by more than 30%, and people with a stable disease. Stable disease here are those patients in whom the tumors have decreased in size but no more than 30%, or people who have had some enlargement that is no bigger than 20% when compared with baseline. And please don't worry, Don't remember those numbers. It's just for you to understand what is coming next in one of the graphics. Then we look at the duration of response. The duration of response is quite important, and this is one of the aspects why the FDA was impressed by Belzutifan. This is a medication that was evaluated for this aspect that goes from the time that you see an impressive reduction of the size of the tumor until the time of progression of the disease. So that's another important one. And please pay attention to the key exploratory endpoints. They included improvement in blood pressure in people who were hypertensive, and a very important one, quality of life. It's very important that the patient feels fine or better than whatever she or he were feeling before the treatment was given. So that's something that was important to evaluate here. Now, the medication was given to people who have confirmation of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, and of course the tumors were not curable. Patients with curable tumors were not included in this study because they were curable. So that's an important aspect. They needed to have some performance status that was acceptable. The blood pressure needed to be well controlled, and they needed to have evidence of disease progression over a period of time of 1 year before they went into the clinical trial. And why is this important? Because of what we discussed at the beginning. People who have a stable disease, no, we don't need to treat. We have to treat are the ones who really are going to give problems, and those are people with progression of disease. People who have a stable disease, we may be just quiet and passive. Now, what is the treatment? The treatment is Belzutifan. How is Belzutifan? Belzutifan comes in capsules. So it is a medication that we take by mouth. Each capsule has 40 milligrams of Belzutifan, and the dose that is recommended of Belzutifan is 120 milligrams daily. In other words, patients who are treated with Belzutifan need to take 3 capsules every day. And in the clinical trial, the medication was provided at a dose of 120 milligrams until the patient exhibited progression, or the patient had an acceptable toxicity, or the patient simply decided not to continue participation in the clinical trial. Now, for you to understand how we do things in clinical trials, we follow closely on these patients. We are looking at the efficacy of the medication and how safe the medication is. And of course, we want to see how the survival of the patient is with that particular drug. And in order to do it objectively, all these patients were evaluated with radiographic studies, CAT scans or MRIs every 2 months for the first year, and then after every 3 months. For blood pressure, we documented their blood pressure medications at baseline. We followed on their doses, on the number of tablets that they were taking. We saw how they were using the medications, and we documented whenever we saw discontinuation or the initiation of any new blood pressure medication. And quality of life was evaluated with questionnaires that were asking people how they feel. Now, this is how the trial was developed. So this is a clinical trial that enrolled patients over a period of 14 months, from September 7, 2021 through November 14, 2022. This is quite unique, and the reason why it was able to recruit that fast is because the need existed and the clinical trial was in many different countries around the world. So it was quite successful in recruitment. If you look at other trials, it has taken years for them to finalize recruitment. And there are some trials that are just publishing some interim results because they haven't been able to really recruit all the patients that are needed. But this is the advantage of having an international clinical trial. Now, we started doing the analysis on October 23rd of 2024. That's what we call the data cutoff. And at that particular time, we have a follow-up of about 2 years and a half in all the patients who participated in the study. There were 72 participants, and all of them received Belzutifan. At the time of the data cutoff of October 23, 41 participants had discontinued, 47% because the disease progressed, 4% because they had clinical progression, and clinical progression means the tumor is stable, but they are not feeling good, and 3% simply because of adverse events. Nevertheless, 31 participants at the time of the data cutoff were on active treatment with Belzutifan, and the information that I'm going to present to all of you is coming from both groups together. So let's go to the baseline characteristics to give you an idea on what kind of patients were included in the trial. The median age of these patients was 51.5 years. The youngest patient was 22 years. The oldest one was 77 years of age. 58% of patients were men, 42% of patients were women. Majority of patients were coming from Western Europe. 30% of patients were coming from North America, the USA, and Canada. The clinical trial was not in Mexico, and 7% of patients were from the rest of the world. These countries were mainly Turkey and Russia. A very interesting aspect here has to do with this aspect. 75% of all the patients who participated in the clinical trial had a prior history of at least one line of systemic therapy. 50% of these patients were previously treated with chemotherapy, CVD, cyclophosphamide, vincristine, and dacarbazine was the main type of chemotherapy. And of course, some of them responded, some of them did not, but at some point they were not responding to chemotherapy any longer, reason why they moved into this particular clinical trial. 44% of these patients were treated before with radiopharmaceuticals. The most common one was Lutathera. There were some patients previously treated with MIBG, and 25% of people were previously exposed to what we call tyrosine kinase inhibitors, some names that maybe some of you are familiar, sunitinib and cabozantinib. Now look at the genetic syndrome history. 39% of patients had a genetic syndrome history. The most common one, not surprisingly, was the paraganglioma syndrome type 4, which was present in 33% of these individuals. 3% of patients had a paraganglioma syndrome type 1 associated with SDHT mutation. They were only 2 patients, and 3%, equivalent to 2 patients, had a paraganglioma syndrome type 5 associated with an SDHA mutation. And as you can see here, the baseline site for disease of metastasis, as discussed before, mainly in the lymph nodes, the skeletal tissue, the liver, and the lungs. So these are some of the baseline characteristics of the patients who participated in the clinical trial. Now, this slide is complicated. Please don't worry. I'm going to tell you exactly what we see in all these graphics. Graphic number 1 is located in the left upper side. In this graphic, you are going to see the response of the tumors radiographically speaking. In other words, the changes in the size of the tumor. Those responses are classified in 3 different categories. What we call a confirmed partial response, which is in green color. That means that these are tumors that have decreased in size by at least 30% when compared with baseline. People who have a stable disease in blue, and people with progressive disease in burgundy. These are people in whom the tumors increase by more than 20% when compared with baseline or develop new lesions. Now, when you look at the waterfall figure, this is the name of the figure, a waterfall figure. The number of people with partial responses was 19. That's what we call the objective response rate. And when you look at the paper, that's the number of 26%. These are people who have a reduction in the size of the tumor of more than 30% when compared with baseline, and it was confirmed with follow-up radiographic studies. Now, when you look at the stable disease and you add it to those people with partial responses, the clinical benefit rate was 85%. In other words, there were several patients, as you can see in this part of the graphic, where there was some degree of tumor size reduction, simply that it was not able to satisfy the definition of the 30%. There were some people in whom the tumors look a little bit larger, but they were also considered a stable disease, and they are added to the clinical benefit rate. Now, of interest, if you look at these and these and these individuals, they had a reduction of 30%, but at the time of the data cutoff, they were not confirmed. That's why they are considered still a stable disease. Nevertheless, on the follow-up, they were individuals that were confirmed and there were partial responses as well. But the report is just for whatever we have at the time of the data cutoff. Now, when you look at the red color, yes, not everybody responded to Belzutifan. There were some people who were resistant to it, people who exhibit progression, unfortunately, and they represented about 15% of all patients in this cohort. Now, let's look at the graphic located in the right side. The graphic that you see in the right side is telling us about the duration of response to Belzutifan in different individuals who participated in the trial. Again, in green, you will see the people in whom the tumor substantially decreased. In blue, people with a stable disease, and in burgundy, people with progressive disease. And in those with both stable disease and partial responses, you can see that the responses, the duration of responses were actually quite long, to the point that the median duration of response in this clinical trial was 20 months. Is this important? Yes, it is impressive. Why it is impressive? When you look at this graphic, you will see that people who responded to Belzutifan, they started decreasing the size of the tumors. But in many patients, it took some time before they were able to achieve a partial response. The time to that response was 11 months. And then on top of that, you add a duration of response of about 20 months. That is telling us that this is a medication that in people who respond to it, they may have a durable response to therapy. That was quite impressive. This is not a study for comparison with other medications, but I can tell you, when you look at cancer medicine in general, this is something that we want to see in most medications that we use in clinical practice, and not all of them are able to show that. So this is something that caught the attention to the regulatory agencies. Now, this is another graphic that is complicated. Please don't worry. The graphic has multiple colors. This is an interesting graphic. Please pay attention to these stars that are at the end of some of the horizontal columns that you see in this graphic. These are people who have been followed for periods of time of 2 to 3 years, and they continue to respond to the therapy at the time of the data cutoff. Now, in gray, you are going to see people who do not have hypertension. They are about 25% of all individuals who participated in this study, and many of them are having prolonged responses. In green, you are going to see people in whom there was a substantial reduction of the blood pressure medications by at least 50% when compared with baseline, and durable for more than 6 months. These are people in whom the tumors were hormonally active. And in the pink color, you are going to see some people who didn't satisfy that definition. Nevertheless, some people in whom the blood pressure improved. But it is interesting here is that in many patients who have a stable disease, despite that they were not able to have an impressive reduction in the size of the tumor, the blood pressure improved substantially. So that's another interesting aspect that is telling us about the clinical benefits related to a medication like Belzutifan. Now, these graphics are complicated somewhat. The progression-free survival is the time in between the initiation of the therapy and the time where you see evidence of disease progression. The number for the whole cohort was in average 22.3 months. What is the meaning of that? About 50% of patients have responses that were longer than 22.3 months. 50% of patients had less than that. Now, Many of you are not familiar with these numbers, but this is an impressive number as well when you see the experience that we have with other medications in other clinical trials for other disease. And when you look at the overall survival, majority of patients in reality who have participated in the clinical trial are still alive, which is important. Now, another important aspect is the quality of life. The quality of life was evaluated by questionnaires. I don't pretend to show you the questionnaires here, but to give you an idea, they are questionnaires that are looking at the global health status and the physical functioning. So what is that? So to give you an idea of how the patient feel, how the social interactions are, how the stress, financially speaking, is felt, how they are able to engage in physical activity, do they sleep, do they eat, how are they doing in general? And when you look at these numbers, the numbers of patients who exhibit either improvement or preservation of quality of life is about 75% in the clinical trial. Again, the numbers, of course, you are not familiar with that, but it's quite impressive as well. Majority of patients were able to preserve quality of life. And when you look at some individual symptoms that are important to keep in mind in the context of cancer, please pay attention to the graphic located in the left lower side, the loss of appetite. People were able to recover appetite. And because of that, people also gain weight. They were able to recover their weight, and that is described in the paper that is published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Pay attention to the second graphic. You see the constipation rates, they decrease. In reality, the constipation improved in many of these individuals. And from a clinical perspective, believe me, I've been familiar with all medications that we use for the treatment of pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. And this is the only medication that I can tell for sure is able to improve constipation by itself. The others need the help or some medications such as laxatives or modifications in their diet in order to improve it. With Belzutifan, the improvement was really clear. And finally, when you look at the pain, and as you know, this is a symptom that is quite overwhelming in majority of patients, the pain also improve. And one of the questions you may have, did we have patients with hypertensive crisis, with a very, very severe hypertension, with problems because of the hormonal excess? The answer is no. We didn't see that. In the paper, there we'll see the description of one patient who developed a severe hypertension, but it was quite interesting. The patient just started Belzutifan. The patient discontinued the antihypertensive medications immediately. No, we cannot do that. We have to give some time to the medication to work, and then later on, depending on how things are, yes, the patient may be able to discontinue the antihypertensives, but we never saw a case of severe hypertension related to the drug. Now, safety. Safety is an important aspect. People wonder what kind of side effects were related to Belzutifan. Yes, there were some side effects, and they are listed in the lower part of the slide. They are what we call treatment-related adverse events, which occur in more than 10% of people. The most common one, anemia. It happened in 88% of patients. Why patients develop anemia? Well, all of us as individuals, as human beings, produce one hormone that is called erythropoietin in our kidneys. That hormone is one of the hormones and factors responsible for the formation of red blood cells in the bone marrow. And when you look at the Belzutifan inhibits again that factor, the hypoxia inducible factor 2 alpha. That factor regulates the production of erythropoietin. By inhibiting that factor, we will decrease the production of erythropoietin. So majority of people who were exposed to Belzutifan develop anemia. That's the most common treatment-related adverse event. In majority of patients, the anemia was mild to moderate. What is the meaning of that? They may have felt some fatigue, but they didn't need to have transfusions of red blood cells and or the use of erythropoietin because we have erythropoietin as a medication to replace whenever the erythropoietin production by the kidneys is decreased. So majority of patients didn't need it. However, 20% of people require transfusions, 20% of people require erythropoietin, and 6% of individuals require both of them. So this is the most important side effect. Now, nobody died because of anemia, but it's a side effect that we have to follow. Now, are we going to stop completely the production of red blood cells? The answer is no. What you see is that there is a reduction of the hemoglobin, and then the concentrations, although stay low, they remain low. So they don't go down farther. But we have to be careful because in some people, the reduction is more impressive than in others. And yes, those individuals in whom the reductions are more impressive will need supportive therapy with erythropoietin or transfusion. Now, this leads us to the conclusion of whatever was presented in Berlin last week. Based on what we have, Belzutifan demonstrated clinically meaningful anti-tumor activity. In other words, the tumors decrease in size or stabilize, and the responses were durable in participants with advanced pheochromocytoma paraganglioma. The word advanced means metastatic or not resectable. Additional clinical benefit was noted because of the improvement in blood pressure. And I can add to that the improvement or the preservation of the quality of life. And when you look at the safety profile, although anemia was a very important adverse event, this is something that has been previously described. We know how to treat it. There was in reality a low frequency of dose reductions and treatment discontinuation. And in reality, large majority of patients were able to continue therapy. Only 2 patients in the clinical trial discontinued participation because of what we believe were treatment-related adverse events, but those were not anemia. In 1 patient was a biochemical abnormality related to a liver enzyme, and in another one, a neurological complication that was reported as treatment-related, but that later on we believe was nothing related to the treatment. It was related simply to the progression of the disease at some point. So with that in mind, we have now a medication that has been reviewed by the FDA. When we submitted the paperwork to the FDA at the beginning of the year, we thought, well, it's going to take a long time for them to tell us what they think. In reality, in 4 months, they called us and they say, we like the medication. They were impressed by the quality of life aspects. They were impressed by the duration of response, but the clinical aspects related to hypertension, and they say this is a medication that patients with pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas need, and they approved it. And currently, Belzutifan is the only FDA-approved therapy for people with pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. For your reference, and I can forward this to you, the medication and the results were published in the most important clinical journal we have in medicine, the New England Journal of Medicine. The publication happened simultaneously with the oral presentation at the European Society of Medical Oncology. And this paper will tell you more details on the scientific aspects of pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma disease. So I'm going to stop here, and I think we have time for questions,
Awesome.
correct?
Thank you so much. That was extremely educational. I learned so much throughout that. And I also think that it's incredibly encouraging for the community also to see the research that's gone into this and how successful the trial has been as well. So I'm going to group a couple of questions together to help us get through because we got quite a few in the chat while you were talking as well. One of the major questions is whether tumor location factors into a treatment plan, and with that tumor location, if genetic versus non-genetic markers play into whether belfutazane is a good treatment option. And I'm sure, as you saw, some people were wondering whether VHL or non-VHL as well.
Very good. Those are very important questions, and I'm going back into this slide. Regarding the location, as we discussed, we have pheochromocytomas, tumors coming from the adrenal gland, and paragangliomas, tumors coming from outside the adrenal gland. The clinical trial, statistically speaking, evaluated the responses, and we can tell that doesn't matter where the location of the tumor is. In other words, you may have a paraganglioma, you may have a pheochromocytoma, and yes, you may have an opportunity or a chance to respond to belzutifan regardless of where the tumor is coming from. I have to be honest, in the clinical trial, we didn't have a lot of patients with head and neck paragangliomas, which is not surprising because in reality, majority of head and neck paragangliomas we see in clinical practice do not spread. There are some that are metastatic. About 10% of the head and neck paragangliomas are metastatic. Now, when you look at the abdominal ones, the pelvic ones, the thoracic ones, the number of metastatic cases may go in between 50 and 75%. For some reason, the ones from the head and neck area have a tendency to behave better, but we don't understand that part. Saying that, the ones who had head and neck paragangliomas of interest were patients of mine, and I can tell you they also responded. So I would say that based on tumor location, we cannot preclude the use of belzutifan. We have to try and see. Although, as we discussed before, not everybody is going to respond. Although based on the results of the clinical trial, majority may do it. So that's
Awesome.
regarding tumor location. Does it seem clear?
Yes.
Thank you. Number two, let's talk about genetics. This is a very important question. When I started this presentation, I told you this is the beginning of the history. And you may not know exactly how clinical trials are developed, but they are quite strict, scientifically speaking, and we have to follow the protocol. So in this protocol, we have not provided yet information on how the responses are based on genetic studies. The protocol, however, indicates that if you have a paraganglioma syndrome 1, type 5, and type 4, which were the cases that were included in this study, yes, you may have a chance or an opportunity to respond to belzutifan. That's really what we see in this study. But does it mean that there is a particular group of genetic mutations that is more sensitive than others in order to respond to belzutifan? Well, that answer is still to be determined. And why is it still pending to be determined? Again, because we follow the protocol. And second, if you look at this table, you will see 30% of patients, 33% of patients didn't have genetic testing baseline. And the reason why they didn't have genetic testing is because they were coming from places or countries where they didn't have that opportunity, where it was expensive, where it was not available, or simply because of personal reasons. There are some patients who simply say, I don't want to know. Nevertheless, when they consented for the clinical trial, they consented for molecular and biochemical studies. And we have that information. We have tumor samples, we have blood samples, and we are doing currently the analysis to determine who are the people who may benefit the most from belzutifan and who are the people who may not respond to belzutifan. Another important aspect related to how the clinical trial was designed, which is important in the world of pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma, is that it did not exclude anybody based on how their genetic features were. And yes, that's important because we need to know if people who we believe may not respond to the treatment do not respond, or if those people conversely may respond to the treatment. And what I can tell you is that we are going to have that answer likely in the second semester of 2026. So I promise you there will be more.
Awesome. We're all looking forward to it. What are
Mhm.
some considerations that there are in determining when in the treatment plan to take belfutazane for metastatic pheo and para? Is there a good time to bring this up as well to maybe transition from something else that they might be taking?
And this is very important because I saw some of the questions that were submitted. So I remember there was an interesting question. Someone asked, if I am doing well with a particular treatment,
Hmm.
should I transition myself to this medication? And the answer is no. As long as you are doing well, as you feel fine, comfortable with whatever medication you are getting, whether it's cabozantinib, whether it's Lutathera, whether it's MIBG, whether it's chemotherapy, please continue on that treatment until you exhibit the last benefit. And hopefully those benefits continue forever. We know that for most part they are not forever, but please stay on that treatment because the tumor is responsive. Don't change. When you change, those tumors may learn how to play with medications, they may become resistant, and they may not respond any longer to whatever therapies come next. So if you are doing well, just stay where you are. That's an important aspect, despite of the introduction of Belzutifan in clinical practice. Now, where is Belzutifan going? Well, we have to keep in mind a very important aspect, at least in the US. Is the only FDA approved therapy. As it is the only FDA approved therapy, is the medication that most insurance are going to approve, are going to support financially speaking, are going to provide to our patients. And the way I see it, if you want to be practical, is if you have a metastatic pheochromocytoma or a metastatic paraganglioma that is symptomatic and or progressive, yes, belzutifan is a treatment to consider in that particular situation. Now, whether you decide or vote for belzutifan, well, the clinician who is in charge of your care will have to make a decision as well. If you ask me in my clinical practice, because I have to be careful, am I going to use belzutifan right now in those rare cases that, for instance, have metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas associated with multiple endocrine neoplasia type 2? No, because I don't have the information yet on those cases coming from the clinical trial or similar cases like those. And I believe, clinically speaking, that for those, I may use other medications such as RET inhibitors. But in majority of patients, given the situation from a practical perspective is right now, yes, belzutifan is somewhat considered the first-line therapy for the treatment of metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas. Now, another exception to that rule, and we have to be careful, there are some people who present with aggressive disease. We talk in those survival curves about individuals in whom the disease progresses very rapidly, very fast. Belzutifan doesn't seem to work that fast. Perhaps in those situations, because they are somewhat an emergency, the faster group of medications are chemotherapy or treatments such as cabozantinib. Those are the ones that work faster. Maybe in those situations we have to consider that. And those are patients who are telling us when they arrive to our clinics, listen, this is bad. You sense it. You say,
Right.
this is bad. For those, let's try to be more aggressive.
Yeah, that's great to know. Thank you. One of the other questions is I'm not sure how much insight you have into this. Is as you know, we have an international community that is tied into the PPA, and a lot of people are asking from Switzerland to the UK and also
Canada.
another Canada. That's right. If you know any insight into whether belfutazane is available internationally.
No yet. I know I don't have, I don't work for Merck. It's in my disclosures, however. And of course, Merck is in charge of that. I know that the interest after having this publication is for them to approach the regulatory agencies, especially in those countries that have participated in the clinical trial initially, to obtain the evaluation of the medication. And if they feel it's solid, just to get the approval of the medication in those places. I know it's going to take a while, but it's the same history in the case of belzutifan for von Hippel-Lindau and for kidney cancer. Usually starts in the USA. Why? Who knows? Maybe it's more pragmatic, perhaps. But at the end, The medication has been approved for kidney cancer and von Hippel-Lindau disease in many other countries around the world. So, for instance, I got a report today from colleagues of mine in Japan. They read the paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they told me they are waiting to see how the Japanese regulatory agencies think about it. But they told me that they were very happy because Belzutifan in Japan was recently approved for von Hippel-Lindau disease and kidney cancer as well.
Wow, that's awesome. That's great
Mhm.
news. And that just shows how connected the community as well that's reading all of the research behind and really bringing more options to patients. So that's wonderful. The next question was, is there something that was unique? This is to the trial specifically, that was unique about the 15% or so who did not respond to belviutazane? Was there any type of like genetics, tumor size, or anything that was unique to them?
Very important question. We haven't seen anything really unique to them, but we know that there should be something. And as I mentioned to all of you, we are doing the studies. We'll get answers, and we'll get answers soon. This is a trial that is powerful. For instance, it's going to look also at mechanisms of resistance, or is looking already at mechanisms of resistance. As you notice, some people responded, but they didn't respond forever, which is unfortunate. Now, many have responded for a long time. We want to know why those people have not responded forever. And that may give us answers on how to improve the care of people with pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma, of course.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you mentioned this. If you did, I missed it. But did you find any difference at all in responses between patients with a non-hormone secreting tumor versus those with hormone secreting?
So what I can tell you, we look at that and we saw responses. Are we able to make a difference statistically speaking in between the two? No, no, at this time. Nevertheless, it's also one of the projects that we are developing in the trial. We are trying to get more correlations in that particular part, but especially because that is like an expression of the genetic and molecular aspects. So I don't have a clear answer yet, but you will get it, and you will get it soon.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. There's quite a few. There's somebody who wanted to say thank you. They said they've been on Belzutifan for 3 years now, and it changed the quality of their life tremendously. And they're off all their blood pressure medications, and that your presentation spoke so accurately to their experience. So they wanted to say thank you for that. So I'm going to
You're
pass that
welcome.
along.
I'm happy to hear that.
Yes. There's also some questions about if you don't have if you're not metastatic, but larger tumors that are not able to be surgically removed for various reasons, if they might be a candidate.
They could be. And I can tell you, the clinical trial by design allowed to include those patients. We only have two patients with those characteristics. And yes, these are individuals who may respond to treatment to belzutifan. And that's important. Now, the question is belzutifan a type of medication that may, for instance, lead or make a tumor that is not resectable resectable? It's not really something that we notice in the clinical trial, but perhaps it does. We have to wait and see. This is something that will come from the clinical experience, especially now that the medication has been approved. We may see cases like this. Hopefully, medication helps with that.
Definitely. There's also some questions about if it makes sense to get on on belzutifan instead of surgery, even if surgery is possible. I think you would just answer that a little bit.
Yes, no, of course, the question could be, the answer could be complicated and it should be individualized. But
Right.
if you ask me, if you have an individual in whom you have a tumor that is resectable, no, go for it. Because what we have to remember is that the only treatment able to cure the disease is surgery. That's the reality. By doing surgery, keeping in mind that although most of them do not give metastases, all of them have the potential to spread. By doing surgery, you may prevent that. So
Right.
surgery is important.
definitely.
Now, in
Thank
the case of people who have disease in whom surgery is possible. Now, you may wonder in people with metastatic disease, is the removal of the primary tumor something that we have to consider that is not really related to Belzutifan per se? What we have in that regard is a very interesting study published maybe 5 years ago in Annals of Surgery. The study is retrospective, so it's far away from perfect. By the design, the methodology was the best as possible. And the study suggests that by doing removal of the primary tumor many times, you improve quality of life, you improve blood pressure, improve, you prevent local complications, you may decrease the tumor spread, and you improve the survival rates in that study by 3 years. And something that is possible, and I believe it's like that for any medication that we have in clinical practice, by decreasing the tumor burden, if later on you have to be on belzutifan, yes, the removal of any large primary tumor may help the medication to work better. That's what I believe, although I don't have any way to prove it. It's just clinical experience.
right. No, thank you for that. Were there any concerns after the trial, or did you see anything with any concerns with maybe long-term side effects from belzutifan, or did it seem like the results were increasing and getting better with time while during the trial?
That very interesting question. Very interesting question. There are two parts of that question, two aspects of that question, two answers. Number one that I didn't discuss with you, and you will see it in the paper. When you look at how the medication works, the time to response is how long it takes for the medication to achieve a reduction of the tumor size of at least 30%. The time to response was 11 months. So it doesn't work that fast.
Okay.
And this is important for all of you to know. If you are on belzutifan, please don't get disappointed, even for the doctors. If you do the follow-up and you see a little bit of reduction, but not really that much, just wait. As long as you are feeling fine with it, as long as you are tolerating the medication well, just wait. Because in some patients, later on, you see the impressive responses. So it's different from many other medications we have in clinical practice. And I can tell you, I've been amazed. I have a particular patient who, after 2 years, exhibited additional reduction in the size of the tumor. So it's a very interesting medication, and we have to keep that in mind because sometimes, especially providers, may get somewhat disappointed because they don't see an impressive reduction, even patients. But if you are feeling better, just wait. Just wait. So that's
Right.
one aspect. Now, the second aspect related to the side effects, as I mentioned before, the anemia is the most important one. Is that something that is going to be bad, worse over time? No, I don't see that. However, some patients, as I mentioned to you before, will need some supportive therapy.
Right.
Now, the supportive therapy, erythropoietin, is expensive. Saying that is medication that we have in some countries available. Uh, if transfusion of red blood cells is a relatively easy, straightforward way to correct the problem if needed. Another one that is important is low oxygen. You may have heard that belzutifan has been associated with what we call hypoxia, low oxygen concentrations. We notice it in the clinical trial as well, but I can tell you it's quite interesting. Patients notice it because the trial by design asked to check on that. But most people were not feeling really much. Some people were treated with some oxygen supplementation for a short period of time. And believe it or not, in some people, the improvement just with some exercise, walk, activities.
Hmm.
So it's a side effect we see, but seems that in most people it's manageable.
That's good to hear. Interesting. And you answered a question that had popped up in the chat, so that worked. That transition was perfect. Somebody did just also ask about normal hemoglobin levels, if that matters in the decision to start on Zutaphen.
Now, by definition, belzutifan will lower the red blood cells. The hemoglobin will go down. And somewhat it implies that the medication starts working because that's the mechanism of action of the drug. But am I going to place someone who has a hemoglobin of 6 or 7, even 8, on treatment with belzutifan? Well, before I do it, I will try to correct the anemia. I will either transfuse the patient or I may use erythropoietin. For most part, in people with pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma, when they have anemia, it's because they have bone metastasis. We have to remember the skeletal tissues where we produce the blood cells, the bone marrow.
Mm.
So if you have bone metastasis, they may be occupying the bone marrow space, and many of these patients may have been treated with radiation therapy that also limits the activity of the bone marrow. And yes, we may see in clinical practice several patients with pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas who have anemia depending on the degree of anemia. If you ask me, and this is just based on the clinical trial design, we were prescribing the medication to people with hemoglobin higher than 10. But if you ask me in clinical practice, can I consider that for someone who has less? The answer is yes, but I will try to correct the anemia or to take the numbers to safer numbers, numbers of hemoglobin I believe, at least 9 or 10, and then we move forward from that. And in the meantime, depending on how things go, if needed, of course, we'll provide additional supportive therapy.
Okay,
That's
thank
how it
you.
is.
I'll do two quick questions and then we'll do one question to wrap it up here at the end. One of the quick questions was there any results by age for the clinical trial that were published?
So we did statistical analysis and we couldn't find any difference regarding responses by age. In other words, people who are young, people who are old, people who are in the mid ages, adults, responded to therapy. Just like that. There were some people who did not, but there was no difference in response based on age. Now, the medication is approved for people older than 12 years of age. So it is approved for adolescents with metastatic pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, which I believe is wonderful, and it may cover some people who have, for instance, the SDHB mutations, which majority of patients in those age have whenever they develop a metastatic pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. Um, so that's wonderful because those individuals have the opportunity, but in the clinical trial, we didn't have any of those patients. So then you may wonder why it was approved like that. Well, because of the information related to another clinical trial for von Hippel-Lindau disease. It was clear that the medication could be safe in those individuals as well.
Right. Last question is there's a few questions about if they are stable metastatic Pheo or para. It doesn't make sense to get on a treatment plan with Belzutifan to prevent future progression if you're not currently on a treatment plan.
No, I will not do it like I will not do that because if the disease is behaving well, just leave it there. If you are able, this is interesting, and don't think that I am a strange person in the comment that I'm going to make. For some reason, there are some tumors that are intelligent.
Hmm.
They spread, they go to places, and they say, "Well, if I kill you, I die." So they understand the situation, and they say, "No, I'm not going to kill you. I'm just going to live with you, and we are going to be together. Yes, you may not like me, but I'm not going to bother you." So it's like having a neighbor that you try to ignore, if you want to see it like that. And I can tell you, based on clinical experience, although some of those patients may exhibit progression at some point in their lives, reason why you have to follow on them long term, many of them continue really fine. And I can tell you, in my clinical practice right now, I have a patient who is 91 years of age with a
Wow.
metastatic pheochromocytoma. He was found with it in 1983. Very interesting history. He was found with it while he was living in Burma, now Myanmar, in those times. He lives now in the USA. And now, because he's tired, he simply says, "Doctor, can we chat by phone?" And he says, "I'm feeling fine. I don't want to see you. I just want to let you know that I'm doing well." What is the point? He's 92. The lifespan of Americans is 75. He made it. He made it quite well. if you want to see it like that. And he's not on any type of treatment. So there are many people who have a stable disease who may just have normal lives. And I hope that if we see those cases, that they are usually the majority ones that we see in clinical practice because those are the ones that I prefer. That's the reality.
Definitely, definitely. And I appreciate leaving it on a positive note as well. I greatly appreciate all of your expertise. Thank you so much for your time and dedication to our entire patient community. This webinar for everyone will be available in a few days on YouTube and also on our website. And we'll also transcribe today's questions and links to answers in the video as well. If you'd like to stay informed about this topic or other events and opportunities or get involved, to sign up, please sign up for our e-news and follow us on any of our social media channels. If this information has been useful to you, also please consider donating at pheopara.org. We thank everyone who attended today, and we hope that you have a fearless rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Really, thank you for everything.